Good evening. Today, John Major asked the people of Northern Ireland to read the framework document for themselves. It looks as if they've taken him at his word. This afternoon, in one post office in the centre of Belfast, 500 copies disappeared in 20 minutes. The Northern Ireland office says it has been inundated with calls from people asking about the document. It was launched by the two Prime Ministers at 9:30 this morning in Belfast. And later, Mr. Major revealed his government's devolution proposals. This report from our political editor, Jim Dougal.
When John Major and John Bruton walked into the Balmoral Conference Centre this morning, they brought to an end 2 years of the most intensive Anglo-Irish negotiations since partition. What they hope they've started is a critical debate which could lead to a once-and-for-all settlement, pointing the way to a lasting peace here.
We seek to help peace, but we are very well aware that only the people of Northern Ireland are able to deliver that peace.
Today's new framework for agreement is a landmark event in the affairs of this island. The two governments are presenting to the political parties in Northern Ireland and to the Irish and British peoples a document which is the most detailed expression to date of our views on the subject of Northern Ireland.
The first proposals to be announced were those dealing with the relationships between North and South and between London and Dublin. In the context of an overall settlement, the Irish government will introduce and support changes to Articles 2 and 3 in a referendum which will seek to remove the claim to jurisdiction over Northern Ireland. The British government will in return change the Government of Ireland Act, the legislation that partitioned Ireland. That Act established the supreme authority of Parliament in Northern Ireland. It's envisaged the wishes of the people here will be paramount in future. The other controversial element is the creation of a cross-border body with executive powers. It would be a condition of service in a new Northern Ireland Assembly that committee chairpersons operate the cross-border institution.
The North-South body that we outline would comprise elected representatives chosen from a new Northern Ireland Assembly and from the Irish Parliament. It would draw its authority from those two bodies. It would operate by agreement and only by agreement. On the United Kingdom side, the North-South body would initially be set up by legislation at Westminster as part of a balanced agreement. It would come into operation following the establishment of the new Northern Ireland Assembly.
The change proposed will address both Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution in the following ways: to remove any jurisdictional or territorial claim of legal right over the territory of Northern Ireland contrary to the will of the people of Northern Ireland, and to provide that the creation of a sovereign United Ireland could therefore only occur in circumstances where a majority of the people of Northern Ireland formally chose to be part of a united Ireland.
After the launch of the framework document, both Prime Ministers left the conference room. Then, to demonstrate that the internal proposals for devolution here are a matter solely for the British government, Mr. Major returned with his ministers to set out how they believe a local administration could be established. There would be an assembly with 90 elected members. It would have legislative and executive responsibility and might eventually control policing. A 3-member panel, elected directly by the people of Northern Ireland, would scrutinise how the Assembly was run and monitor contentious legislation. Committees of the Assembly would run government departments. Membership of the committees would be broadly in line with party strengths in the Assembly. And what are called checks and balances would make sure that the Assembly was run fairly.
We're not engaged in anything other than a dialogue that seeks to embrace as many people as possible so that all those ideas can come forward. And of course, we want the ideas of the political parties. That's what we've been discussing with them for the past 4 years.
John Major knows that the history of Northern Ireland is littered with failed initiatives, but the events of the past year have given him hope that the seemingly impossible can happen. Whether he's right or not, the coming months will tell.
The framework document was described by the DUP leader Ian Paisley as a one-way street to Dublin. But the SDLP's John Hume said unionists should trust themselves to negotiate the future for their people.
With worldwide media interest, the framework document was given to journalists just before 9. The political parties here got their hands on it a short time earlier. This afternoon, a House of Commons packed to capacity heard an angry Ken McGuinness condemning its contents.
When the Prime Minister comes to write his memoirs, does he believe that, like his predecessor, he will regret his part in driving Northern Ireland back at least 10 years by promoting this dishonourable blueprint for an all-Ireland?
I will happily say to the honourable gentleman, I will sit down with the honourable gentleman and go through that document paragraph by paragraph, line by line, word by word, and try and reassure the honourable gentleman that there is nothing in that to fear, and everything in that that may make progress to what he wishes for his constituents and Northern Ireland, and what I and this House wish for his constituents and Northern Ireland, a permanent peace and a prosperous future.
The DUP chose to stay away from the Commons debate, in their words, to consider the document. Earlier, Ian Paisley had described it as the road to Dublin.
The document is a one-way street, and it's sole line, it's fine-tuned to one way for Northern Ireland only, and that is the IRA way, the Dublin way, the Nationalist way, and the Republican way. There is no unionist. Proposal or anything to discuss in that document. It is a single-line way, a one-way street to Dublin.
The SDLP, however, maintained there was nothing in it that anyone should fear, essentially because the framework is based on the principle of consent.
And could I also say to the unionist people, whose fears and tensions I understand, given the 25 years that we've been through, as we have said before, this problem cannot be resolved without the participation and agreement of the unionist people. Because of their geography and their numbers, as we know, they don't trust governments. All they're now being asked is to trust themselves and come to the table if they think they don't agree with this. Come to the table and find out. Join all parties now, as soon as possible, at that table with both governments to begin the difficult process of reaching that agreement.
Sinn Féin moved with caution, but stated that the document was an acceptance that there is a need for change.
We see quite explicitly an acknowledgement that internal settlement is not a solution. So it's slow, and at times it's at a snail's pace. And we'll have to give you a more definitive view when we've read the entire situation. But as a basis for discussion, and for us to put our own views for an end to British jurisdiction, I think that we can now move into that situation.
For Alliance, the document presents a challenge to everyone to start talking.
Broadly speaking, I would repeat what I said after meeting the Prime Minister last week. I do believe that this is a basis for negotiations. I do not believe that it's a basis for hysteria or alarm.
For the emerging loyalist opinion makers, there was no rush to reach early conclusions.
Well, there won't be any knee-jerk reaction from us. We believe that the framework document itself and the process is far too important to be making snap judgments. And we will be looking at it very carefully before we make a response.
As a question mark hangs over whether John Major can continue to count on unionist voting power, the leader of the opposition pledged this afternoon that whatever political developments emerged, he is committed to the framework document's contents.
As he knows, we have supported the government throughout the peace process in times of difficulty as well as times of progress, and we do so again today without hesitation. And people in Northern Ireland should know that whatever party is in government, this process will continue, pursued, I hope, with the same patience and determination, and motivated by the same desire for peace.
Well, a short time ago, I spoke to the Ulster Unionist MP Ken McGuinness about the Prime Minister's insistence in the Commons that the framework document contained proposals and that nothing would be imposed, an argument strengthened by John Major's concession in the House that the Anglo-Irish agreement hadn't been introduced in the right way. Did Ken McGuinness not believe him now?
It's not a question of believing him. I think that the Prime Minister, in his simplistic approach, in his sort of very folksy approach to the House today, didn't get across the idea of a 58-paragraph convoluted document that it took the draftsmen 2 years to put together, built into that, we can see evidence of a blueprint for a All-Ireland state. And we're not going to go down the road of considering something which is that devious intent, perhaps beyond the time when John Major is Prime Minister.
When you said he'd made a concession to the IRA, he said he was the implacable enemy of their violence. The House clearly believed him in that. If you don't, how do you want to see those who support you, and what are you saying to them about where you're going to lead them from now on?
Irrespective of what the Prime Minister says about his implacable opposition to violence, his negotiators have made no progress whatsoever since the 31st of August towards the disbandment of paramilitary organisations like the IRA or the decommissioning of weapons. And it's up to the Martin McGuinnesses and the Jerry Adamses to stop lecturing hypocritically the Ulster Unionists and saying that we must stop saying no. They have said no to the disbandment of their private army. They have said no to the decommissioning of weapons, and that's something that government must face up to with the press, with the people of Northern Ireland, with elected politicians. We must all now concentrate on that.
Now, the Ulster Unionist voices were many that were heard today. One that was absent was that of your party leader. Is there any significance in that?
As you know, Jim Molyneux leads a team. He delegates members of the team to do various jobs at different times, and he himself is back in Northern Ireland now to reassure the community there, to sit down with his advisors and look at the long-term strategy that we have to, and what adjustments may have to be made in the wake of this agreement today. And what he will want now is to ensure that there's a degree of solid, quiet, considered calmness amongst the unionist community as we decide how we continue the battle that we have been waging on behalf of the greater number of people in Northern Ireland. Right. We will continue to do that, and we know that the people will support constructive and forward-looking policies that are in the interests of the entire community.
Ken McGuinness, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, within minutes of his press conference ending, the Prime Minister spoke to our political editor, Jim Dougal, at Balmoral, and he responded first to the question that the North-South body that's been proposed may be regarded by some unionists as an all-Ireland body in waiting.
How does it come to be established? Firstly, after discussions between the political parties in the North, then after a referendum of all the people of the North, then after legislation at Westminster. Then who are the representatives from the North? They will be the elected representatives from the Northern Ireland Assembly. That is who will be on the North-South body. What can the North-South body do? Well, its powers will derive from the discussions with the political parties and from what decisions the Northern Ireland Assembly takes about devolving powers. So there's no great frightening surprises that's suddenly going to emerge there.
Prime Minister, a lot of people will look at this document and they'll say, why is there no specific wording on the changes to Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution, this constitutional territorial claim?
Well, the specific wording isn't yet agreed, but the determination, as the Taoiseach set out this morning, to make the changes and put those changes both to Articles 2 and Articles 3 before the people in the Republic is quite clear. Now, many people in the North, many doubters in the North, did not believe that the Irish government would commit themselves to making changes to Article 2. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. You heard, millions would have heard, the Taoiseach specifically make that point this morning. And the intention of that is perfectly clear.
This business of the internal arrangements for Northern Ireland, now some people could well say not really internal arrangements because they hinge on participation with Dublin and cross-border bodies. It's not really a standalone assembly.
No, I don't agree with that, with respect. The Northern Ireland Assembly will be elected by the people of Northern Ireland by proportional representation. To the extent that it's answerable, it is answerable to the people of Northern Ireland, and to an extent, of course, to the United Kingdom Parliament as well. But it is not answerable in any other direction. It will appoint representatives from amongst its number to attend the North-South body. But in fact, the responsibility flow is precisely the reverse to that you suggested, because the North-South body itself cannot make decisions without the consent of the Northern Ireland body, not the other way round.
Well, let's pause now and look again at the contents of the two documents launched today. How different are today's proposals from previous attempts at squaring the political circle here? Chris Capper reports.
Proposals for a North-South body, a Council of Ireland, brought down the devolved government devised at Sunningdale. Inter-party talks didn't last when the Constitutional Convention sat a few years later. A locally elected assembly failed in the early 80s. And unionists hated the role given to Dublin in the Anglo-Irish Agreement. Have the long negotiations towards today's proposals produced anything that can be said to be really new?
These are significant new proposals. The British government has gone further now in its proposal for a North-South body than it has gone in the past in an attempt to woo nationalists. But on the other hand, they're saying to the unionists that this North-South body will be accountable. You will have a major role in the way it develops.
Analysts have also identified significant changes in the proposals for a Northern Ireland Assembly, along with a three-person elected panel.
Here the two governments have learnt from what happened at Sunningdale. They're not going to try and impose a false coalition government. They've done something quite novel. They're proposing to separate what I think is an executive, they call a panel, and I think is really best described as a collective presidency, from the Assembly. And that panel would be required to operate unanimously. It would have veto powers over the Assembly. The Assembly would not operate wholly on a power-sharing basis. It would operate on the principle of proportionality, which unionists have insisted upon.
One of the signatories to the Anglo-Irish Agreement says steps have been taken this time to avoid unionist protests.
Many years have passed and, there is a will in Northern Ireland to reach some kind of agreement, and it's unthreatening because the consent issue has now been finally resolved in unambiguous terms with the support of all parties in the state and 80% of our people. There's a much better chance of unionists eventually recognising this and reacting positively.
A former Secretary of State who felt the strength of unionist anger at the Anglo-Irish Agreement says there's a big difference this time.
I think flowing from the better understanding between the British and Irish governments that the Anglo-Irish Agreement brought, we've now seen better cooperation. We've now seen the ending of violence, so we hope that it will be a permanent end to violence, as we see at the moment, a ceasefire. And that's made it possible now for there to be talks between the parties in Northern Ireland. I hope those will go forward.
Away from the new studios, detailed examinations will now begin into ideas their proposers hope will be new and different enough to succeed where all their predecessors failed.
Well, in the Dáil this afternoon, the Taoiseach John Bruton appealed to the people of Northern Ireland to give the framework a fair reading. As our Dublin correspondent Shane Harrison reports, the document's been welcomed by the opposition parties in the Republic, including Fianna Fáil.
Maybe it was the rain, but Dublin shoppers this morning were showing little interest in what the Taoiseach called a landmark document. By the time the sun had come out several hours later, people had time to think about the framework and the implications for Articles 2 and 3.
I haven't really been following it that much. I think if it brings peace, then that's cool. And that's all we want, isn't it?
I think it's the best solution that we've got in the last 70 or 75 years.
Well, I hope they don't do anything to amend Articles 2 and 3. They should be left exactly as they are. I don't think it's part of the Constitution and it shouldn't be changed. I don't see any reason why it should be.
The man who as Taoiseach signed the Downing Street Declaration 14 months ago wouldn't be drawn on constitutional change, default mechanisms, or how the document had changed since he left office in December. But it was for him, he said, a proud day.
You don't lose anything by talking. Nobody has lost anything by peace. Everybody has gained, and everybody wants to gain for normality.
The Taoiseach returned to the Dáil a short time ago to a triumphant, if not a triumphalist, welcome. He again pleaded for nationalists and unionists to treat the document fairly.
Read it. Think about it. Give us your ideas. But above all, give us your commitment, your faith in the future.
The Fianna Fáil leader, Bertie Ahern, said the framework's compromises were reasonable and sensible. The document, he said, had not significantly changed since his party left office.
Well, the outcome of negotiations on the document will, of course, be the subject of referenda north and south. So what's been the public reaction to the launch of the document today? Martin McGinley's been hearing from people in Belfast and Londonderry.
Hundreds of copies of the framework document disappeared within minutes at a central Belfast post office this afternoon, leaving some disgruntled customers.
I've just been told that were only 500 copies issued to Castle Street here. Now, we're talking about a document which is affecting all the lives of all the people in Northern Ireland, and we get this paltry 500 copies.
The document's being distributed to 28 main post offices throughout Northern Ireland. The NIO say the printers will keep up with demand.
Well, I just wanted to have a read to see what it was. I think if people just took time to sit down and read it before jumping to any conclusions, really that's what it's about, that's what everybody wants.
The DUP leader Ian Paisley has already said the document marks the road to Dublin. But there were differing views outside the bus station at Great Victoria Street in Belfast.
If we can fight for a while around the table, people don't want to go back to trouble again, I don't think. Somebody will sort out some way, surely to God.
I mean, you're not going to get anywhere if you don't try. You have to try.
There's talk of it's going to be constructive, but to help the peace or something, but not if it's going to go down the road towards Dublin.
It would be lovely to return to a time when we were building bridges and successfully completing those bridges rather than having schism and division in our community.
As a visitor, you've noticed a difference between Northern Ireland a year ago and Northern Ireland today?
Yeah, like day and night, I could say that, honestly, yeah. And I'm very happy about it. And I have to learn to not be too negative, and I want to say that to the people here in Belfast as well.
Close by in the Europa Hotel, businessmen caught up on the news at an exhibition featuring security equipment.
Most of our equipment can be used under bomb alert situations, and of course, and here you are working against us. But nevertheless, you know, I'd rather a company found another route and you found peace. It's wonderful.
I think everybody should keep a bit calmer about it and continue talking. I think that's the essential thing.
And that was also the message from Strand Road in Derry this afternoon.
Well, I think it's very good, definitely, because I wouldn't want to go back to what we've had 25 years of. We have lived in the middle of it now. I know what it's all about.
Well, I do hear of it. I like to see it being successful. I think it's the only opportunity we have.
We've sit down and talk about it. Let them have their say, let us have our say, and sit, agree, and both teams agree. And there could be peace here forever.
And if you want a copy of the framework document, you can have one posted out to you by phoning 0800 374 964. 0800 374 964. I'm joined by our political editor, Jim Dougal. I have two questions from opposed perspectives. Firstly, what's the extent of Ulster Unionist alienation from the government now?
Well, I think the government does have a problem here because people who would be described as moderate unionist politicians were saying to me today that there's nothing in this document which is consistent with staying within the union. Now, the government doesn't agree with that. In fact, their view is totally the opposite, that this does not affect the union. I think perhaps the government is hoping that because they've distributed so many of these documents that public opinion might persuade their politicians otherwise. But they are relieved that the unionists will talk to them, albeit about something else.
Secondly, Jim, is the hand of Gerry Adams strengthened or weakened as the Ardèche approaches?
Well, I think the fact that there is so much unionist discomfort may persuade nationalists that there is something in this for them. I don't expect Sinn Féin to rush to instant analysis. That's not the way they do things. They took 6 months to look at the Downing Street Declaration, so I would think it'll be some time before we hear exactly what their views are.
Jim Dougal, thank you very much.
Major and Bruton unveil the long-awaited framework document. Sinn Féin give a guarded welcome, Loyalists reserve judgment. Unionists express anger. Paisley says proposals can't work.
It's my duty as Prime Minister to maintain the Union for as long as that is the will of the people. It is a duty in which I strongly believe, and one which these proposals protect.
The change proposed will address both Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution in the following ways: to remove any jurisdictional or territorial claim of legal right over the territory of Northern Ireland, contrary to the will of the people of Northern Ireland.
Good evening. You're watching UTV Live at 6 on Wednesday, February the 22nd. It took 2 years to put together, and this morning in Belfast, the British and Irish Prime Ministers published their long-awaited proposals for the future of Northern Ireland. John Major and John Bruton said nothing would be imposed on people here. Unionists have condemned it as unworkable. Gerry Adams says it's an acknowledgement that partition and British rule in Ireland have failed. John Major insists everyone in Northern Ireland should read the framework document for themselves before they judge it. Thousands of people have already queued in post offices to snap up their copies. So what exactly are the government proposals? There would be an assembly consisting of 90 seats with built-in safeguards. There would also be changes in the Irish Constitution, which claims jurisdiction over Northern Ireland.
At the outset, both governments reaffirm what they term the guiding principles of self-determination, emphasise consent and the protection of the rights and identities of both traditions. The framework for agreement, as it's called, commits the Irish government to changes in its constitution, so that no territorial claim like that contained in Articles 2 and 3 is asserted. Dublin would also be locked into recognising the legitimacy of any decision made by Northern Ireland voters over the province's constitutional status. For its part, the British government proposes legislation to uphold the democratic wish of the majority here. The two governments propose a new North-South body made up of representatives from a new Northern Ireland Assembly and Dáil Éireann and accountable to both institutions. Its three designated functions, consultative, harmonising and executive, would deal with aspects of, say, trade, industrial development, transport, health, social welfare and education. Functions would be devolved by the Assembly and the Dáil, but only if the two sides agree. Crucially, with an eye to Europe, the new North-South body would oversee EU programmes and initiatives. The framework also envisages a new parliamentary forum, again made up of representatives from the Assembly and the Dáil. In addition, provisions made for the protection of rights. A human rights charter or covenant is what's in mind, North and South. And what of the new Assembly itself? It would be made up of 90 members, elected for a fixed term under proportional representation. It would possess legislative and executive powers just like the failed 1973 Assembly. There would also be a system of Assembly committees, made up broadly in proportion to party strengths in the House. On top of that, the government would put in place checks and balances intended to sustain confidence in the institutions. A separate panel, probably of 3 people, would serve as a kind of watchdog group, or as the government puts it, to complement the working of the Assembly. This panel could be elected in a separate poll involving Northern Ireland as a single constituency, again on the basis of proportional representation. However, there's a fallback position if the Assembly ceases to operate for whatever reason. The government says other arrangements will be put in place to continue North-South cooperation through formal structures.
The document was launched by the two Prime Ministers in Belfast this morning. They said nothing would be agreed until everything was agreed.
John Major and John Britton arrived at the Balmoral Conference Centre after having breakfast at Hillsborough Castle. Copies of the framework document had been handed out to hundreds of journalists before the two Prime Ministers gave their addresses.
Our proposals this morning are based on several principles: self-determination, consent, democratic and peaceful methods, and respect for the identities of both traditions. Consent is and will remain paramount in our policy. It's the democratic right and the safeguard of the people of Northern Ireland. No proposals for the future would be workable, let alone successful, without the consent and the active support of the people of Northern Ireland. It is they who are the people who carry them out and whose lives would be affected by them. And that is why an eventual settlement must be agreed by the parties, supported by the people of Northern Ireland in a referendum, and approved by Parliament, a triple consent procedure.
We believe that, taken in the round, these proposals offer a basis for structured discussions leading to a new agreement. It is our hope that the political parties, having given these proposals the attention they deserve, will take a similar view. There can be no doubt about the enormous desire on the part of the ordinary public here in the rest of Ireland and in Britain for the earliest possible resumption of political dialogue.
Later, the two premiers answered questions.
Yes, fourth row.
Ken Reid, Ulster Television. Prime Minister, you go to great lengths here to stress that this is not joint authority. But considering most of the leaks in the Times article are actually in the document that you've produced this morning, how can you convince the Unionists otherwise?
Well, what I'm inviting people to do is to read the document, to read it in context and not out of context, which is what they saw in the Times document. Let me give you a particular illustration about the way in which fears arose as a result of a partial leak and often can. There was one of the aspects of that leak was that responsibility for education would be devolved to the North-South body. And I understand the fears that existed in the North about that. They saw every aspect of education being subsumed in a North-South body, and perhaps significant changes to the traditional way in which education is managed in the North. Rubbish. Absolute rubbish.
Well, later the Prime Minister spoke to our political correspondent Ken Reid. He asked him about unionist fears over the document.
I think there are bound to be concerns. There are always going to be concerns. What I invite people to do is to look at what the document actually says, look at the safeguards that are built into the document, and look at the gains that can come about as a result of the document. Now, that is what I'm seeking, a mature consideration and examination. And of course, this isn't a blueprint. This isn't a prescription. This is something that is laid before the political parties for further discussion. If they have other ideas, we're prepared to entertain those other ideas. So I see no reason for fears and worry. This is something that can edge the process forward, and I wish to see it move forward.
In the House of Commons yesterday, you said you'd read the Ulster Unionists document and indeed Ian Paisley's. I mean, are those documents valuable to you? Will you use them? And
every document is valuable, yes. I'm very pleased to see ideas being brought forward. That is what we wish. I wish to draw ideas from the community. That is the way to provide a proper consensus that people wish to see. Nobody doubts, from any part of the political spectrum, the scale and size of the prize that exists if we can edge this process forward into permanence. That's what I wish to do. I am prepared to take as much discussion, as much talk, as much consideration as is necessary in order to do that.
Will you be starting bilateral talks with the parties here very shortly?
I think that's probably the way it will go. What I would anticipate is that we will let this document lie on the table, as it were, for a while people have a chance to consider it, come and ask questions about it if there are things they think are ambiguous or things that worry them, but they have a chance to consult their constituents. The people of Northern Ireland will want their own say in this, their future. They will want their own say, and the democratic political parties will want to talk to their constituents about it. Now, I want to leave some time for that to happen. They will want to express a view, the community leaders will, the churches will, the business community will. All that is immensely valuable. Let the ideas circulate. Let people see what is really there and ignore what is not there.
Now, the Irish government are urging your government for a government minister to start speaking to Sinn Féin. Will that happen soon?
Well, we're not ready for that yet. It depends on what progress is made in the talks with the political representatives of Sinn Féin. I am open to those discussions beginning when sufficient progress has been made and when there are matters then on the table to be discussed that require ministerial involvement. I've made that clear, but we haven't quite got there yet.
How damaging was the Times leak?
Very damaging.
Did it almost destroy the thing?
I don't think it almost destroyed it, no, but I think whomsoever leaked it partially and out of context to the Times certainly didn't do so with the interests of carrying the debate forward. So it was very damaging, and it aroused a large number of fears that are frankly phony fears.
Ken Reid then asked John Bruton why the wording of any constitutional change in the Republic had not been included in the document.
We've given a clear political commitment as to what we want to do. We want to take the territorial claim out. The detailed wording of that is obviously going to be a matter for the Dáil and the Senate. It wouldn't be possible for any sovereign state to negotiate the precise wordings down to commas and full stops of its constitution with another country. And clearly we couldn't do that with Britain. So out of respect for the Dáil, we have simply stated what the political intent is of the change we're going to make in the Constitution. It will be a matter for putting detail on that in the Dáil and in the Senate and ultimately in what is put to the people. But none of these arrangements will come into place unless they all come into place. There won't be cross-border institutions unless there's a change in Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution. And there won't be a change in Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution without cross-border institutions. There's this balance here to make sure that both communities, as I say, feel at home in their own place.
But have you read what the Ulster Unionists and the DUP have said this week? I mean, have you looked at their documents?
I have looked at their documents, and their documents are very welcome. And I think if we hadn't produced the framework document from the governments, those documents mightn't have been produced. Our document, in a sense, challenged them to think about how they're going to solve the problem. Now, I would have to say that those documents go a considerable distance and they're valuable. But it would be fair to say that those documents, if you like, are concerned
with the needs of the unionist community represented by unionists. We're not actually going to make progress until unionists, for example, try to put forward proposals that will satisfy nationalists, and nationalists try to put forward proposals that will satisfy unionists.
Well, John Major was applauded in the Commons this afternoon after outlining details of the document to MPs. But unionists told him he'd set the peace process back by years.
John Major returned from Belfast to the Commons this afternoon to hear support for the framework document from the three main political parties. He once again outlined its content, stressing that nothing would be imposed.
This provides a triple lock designed to ensure that nothing is implemented without consent. Madam Speaker, the prize from a successful outcome to the peace process is immense. We want to see the people of Northern Ireland permanently free from the fear of terrorist violence.
It isn't often the leader of the opposition is so supportive of the Prime Minister.
The House of Peace has stayed shut and locked in Northern Ireland for too many years. This agreement is the key to its door. No doubt entering in will pose its own risks and challenges, but how much better that will be than to stay forever outside, battered by the elements of hatred and mistrust.
But support in the Commons wasn't quite complete.
Does he believe that, like his predecessor, he will regret his part in driving Northern Ireland back at least 10 years by promoting this dishonourable blueprint for an all-Ireland?
Could he possibly assure the people of Northern Ireland this afternoon that as a result of his new policy announced today, the union between Great Britain and Northern Ireland is more secure today than it was yesterday?
But I say to the honourable gentleman, it is right to try. And I say this to the honourable gentleman too. I don't believe any Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Conservative or non-Conservative, could or should sit in Downing Street without actively trying to find a way out of the problems that have existed for so long.
While John Major won support today in the Commons for the framework document, there are some Tory MPs worried that it moves more towards joint authority than even the Times leak suggested. It's also difficult now to see how unionists can continue to support the government, even if the circumstances did arise where they could join with Labour to defeat the Tories. Tony Blair told the Commons this afternoon that the framework document process continues, whichever government is in power.
Well, the DUP chose to stay away from Westminster today. However, their leaders made their feelings known on the document at a news conference in Belfast.
At their news conference, the DUP said the document was dead and said they wouldn't enter into any negotiations with the government on it. Party leader Ian Paisley said unionists had rejected it. He said John Major should announce tomorrow that it's over. Dr Paisley isn't taken either by John Bruton's promise to alter Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution.
He said he didn't know yet what the wording would be. Now, I give it to you that they discussed it for 2 years, and they don't even know what the wording is to be.
What on earth would they have a territorial claim for when they've been given an inside route where they can be directly given executive authority over Northern Ireland? That's what's contained within this. And not only the executive areas that are contained within this, but it's already indicated that it can be expanded.
Dr Paisley also criticised the proposed North-South body, which he said would operate with or without an assembly. On the assembly itself, he said he could never be part of it.
I'm asked to put myself up as a candidate in my own country for the body that's going to govern my country, the local authority, the local council, the local parliament, but I can never hold office in it.
After they'd spent almost an hour tearing the framework document to shreds, I put it to the DUP that their position would be perceived on the document as very negative, and that again, they were saying no.
Do you want me to punch you in the nose? Yes or no? Now, it depends on the question that is asked, whether you answer yes or no. And if we as unionists are asked, do we want to undermine the union? Do we want to go into United Ireland? The answer is no. Of course it is, because our job is to maintain and strengthen the union. And it's about time somebody was asking questions which would get a yes from the unionist community.
Dr Paisley finished by saying he'd spoken with Jim Molyneux today and that they were saying the same things.
I'm very happy about that the unionist family is coming together. And in fact, there will be further evidence of that this week, inside hours indeed.
Well, the Sinn Féin President, Gerry Adams, says the framework document is an acknowledgement of the failure of British rule in Ireland. Loyalists are reserving judgment, but appear reassured by the consent principle which underpins all clauses in the 15-page document.
Gerry Adams appeared broadly satisfied when he faced the press in West Belfast this afternoon. He said it was clear, having read the document, that it recognised the need for fundamental reform, the kind of change Republicans had been agitating for more than 70 years.
We see within the document, explicitly and implicitly, an ethos which recognises an all-island settlement. We see the general acceptance that partition has failed and that an internal settlement is not a solution.
He said the latest political initiative had moved Northern Ireland closer to an all-Ireland settlement, and he called on unionist leaders to come to the table and negotiate a workable settlement.
It is worth noting that over the last 25 years, that every initiative, every option, every proposal which has come from either the British or from the Irish and British governments has, at a snail's pace, but has nonetheless moved in a general sense towards an all-Ireland settlement. Now, having said that, I have no doubt when we sit down and discuss this document in some detail that we won't agree with everything that's in it. And that's why I stress the point that it's a discussion document, that we will be bringing our views to discussions and the unionists should bring theirs.
Sinn Féin say the framework document will assist the transition from one stage of the peace process to the next, with inclusive dialogue leading eventually to a political settlement. Clearly they don't agree with many facets of it and know there will be some serious horse trading ahead. But privately they hope that once embarked upon, the process will force people out of entrenched positions and build up a momentum which will be very difficult to stop. But as if to emphasise the fact that politics is a matter of perception, loyalists too, whilst less happy with the framework's contents, appeared reassured by the consent clauses. The Ulster Democratic Party, like the Progressive Unionists, will meet to discuss its response. But it said many loyalists couldn't understand why mainstream unionists were objecting so furiously.
Well, the most important criticism from the loyalist community would be that we are concerned about the level of powers that the Southern Government may have on any bodies that are going to be discussed in relation to cross-border institutions. I think what's important about the document is that it is based on the consent of the political parties here in Northern Ireland and the consent of the people in Northern Ireland. And I think as long as those principles are adhered to, the people of Northern Ireland may not have nothing to fear.
In Dublin today, as in Belfast, political representatives and the people on the street were being told the key to change now rests in their hands. In the Dáil, the opposition leader, Bertie Ahern, sounded a note of concern on constitutional change. On the streets, reaction was mixed.
Tributes were paid from all sides of the Dáil this afternoon to the former Taoiseach Albert Reynolds and the Taoiseach Dick Spring for their work on the framework document. Nevertheless, it was John Bruton who got the standing ovation on his return from Belfast today. He outlined the contents of the document and appealed for the support of the House.
Read it. Think about it. Give us your ideas. But above all, give us your commitment, your faith in the future.
The opposition leader, Bertie Ahern, warmly welcomed the framework document, but immediately put on record his concern that the part relating to the removal of the Republic's constitutional claim to Northern Ireland is less specific than when he left the intergovernmental process in mid-November.
I also regret, as I shall set out in more detail later, that the understanding on constitutional change was not fully tied up. The Taoiseach and Sir Patrick Mayhew at their meeting in mid-November, prior to the breakup of the last government, intended to refer the matter for final decision to the Taoiseach and the British Prime Minister.
And earlier, as Fianna Fáil TDs studied the document, they had echoed their leaders' concerns. The Taoiseach has stressed that constitutional change and cross-border bodies are dependent on the vote of the people here in a referendum, the carrot being prosperity for all. So will they want to vote for change?
It wouldn't be of major concern to me. I'd be more concerned to see peace being long-lasting in the country, and I think that we all must share the same aspirations, both north and south, for peace in the country.
Well, I can't speak for everybody, but I think it would. You know, I think it would be something that would need to be sold to people. Memories go back a long way, you know.
And we're all in Europe now anyway. So I think that's really it's making a mountain out of a molehill to get too involved in that.
And Albert Reynolds refused to be drawn on constitutional issues today, but said it was a proud day.
Of course it is. I mean, it's the greatest achievement in political life for any politician is to make a contribution to the saving of even one life.
We apologise for some of the sound quality in that report from Dublin. Well, following today's events closely, our political correspondent Ken Reid. He's with me now. Ken, the initial reaction from the political parties, and particularly the Unionists, is predictable.
Well, it is. I think we knew before today what the Unionists were going to say. I think that the leaks in the Times and so forth, that really made the Unionist strategy fairly clear. John Hume in the House of Commons welcomed the document, and Sinn Féin appear to have given it a welcome as well.
Just getting back to the Unionist reaction, this is on top of the fact that the Prime Minister says it is a consultative document, so therefore you'd have thought there's nothing to fear.
Yes, well, the Prime Minister keeps repeating this, but I think that talking to people today, particularly Unionists, they were saying that the document is written in such a way that it appears more than that. Now, the SDLP, for example, would dismiss that. We'll have to wait and see. The Prime Minister did stress, as Mr Bruton did, this principle of consent.
There is a question mark now, is there not, over Jim Molyneux's judgment in all of this. Is he now in a difficult position?
Well, I think he is, actually. The leadership of the Unionist Party comes up next month when the Unionist Council meets. And at this stage, it looks as if Jim Molyneux would then be re-elected. They were saying unopposed. But I have to say that talking to some Unionist figures this afternoon, they felt that their leader was now in a difficult position, and they weren't prepared to come out into the open. But they felt, well, he was the man who said they had a special relationship with the government. And now the framework documents being published, Willie Ross said today that it's worse than they expected. So I think Jim Molyneux is in a difficult position.
Can he remain as leader, do you think?
In the short term, yes, but perhaps after being elected, maybe sometime in the next year or so, he may step down. I noticed the Belfast Telegraph tonight were saying that they felt that his leadership was now in question. I don't know about that, but at the end of the day, people are saying that this special relationship with John Major obviously didn't exist. At the same time, it's important to note the moves towards Unionist unity. And tonight, for example, there's the second meeting of this committee that the DUP organised. Ian Paisley and Peter Robinson and Jim Rogers, the Unionist councillor, attended. And they'll be having a second meeting tonight, and it'll be interesting to see what actually comes out of that.
For now, Ken Reid, thank you. Well, now in the next part of tonight's programme, the rest of today's top stories. Belfast Lord Mayor meets the Lord Mayor of Dublin in the City Hall. And we meet Claire Dobbin, a law student at Clare College in Cambridge. She'll be telling us how she felt when she failed the qualifying. Join us in a couple of minutes. The SDLP from London, and in our studio in Derry, Martin McGuinness from Sinn Féin. I understand we don't have Seamus Mallon in London just at the moment, so I'll turn to you, Martin McGuinness. First of all, what's in it for Sinn Féin?
Well, Sinn Féin will consider what is in it, and over the course of the next few weeks we will consult and have our deliberations on it. And after the Ardèche, Sinn Féin will make its very considered position. But I think that the big story of today is the reality that the framework document has now been published, so that has cleared the way for all the parties to come to the negotiating table. And there's a very great expectation now, right throughout the entire community, that we should do that.
Well, according to the Unionists, there's quite a lot in it for Nationalists and Republicans.
Well, clearly in the document there is an explicit acknowledgement by the British government that the six-county state has failed, that partition has failed, and that even British rule itself has failed. What we have to do now is move on to new arrangements. The only way we can get those arrangements is through negotiations.
Do you see this as joint authority?
Well, I clearly see it as an opportunity for us to move into all-party talks, which has to be the next stage in the process. We have to work out new arrangements with all the other people. We're prepared to go to the negotiating table on the basis of our Republican agenda, and we expect other parties, Unionists and others, to come with theirs, and we're quite prepared to discuss all of that with them.
It still falls short of your bottom line, which is a united Ireland.
Well, our position is that we wish to see an end to British jurisdiction in Ireland. That's absolutely correct, and we wish to negotiate that with the British government and with the Unionists. And here we have, and the logic of all that has happened today clearly tells us that if the British government accepts that all that has gone before has been a failure, then we have to move on to a totally new order on this island. We have to negotiate it, and we need to talk to the unionists and the British government about all of that. Yes.
I'd like to move to Seamus Mallon, who can join us from London. Seamus Mallon, is that your reading of the document today, an acceptance by the British government that everything that has gone before has been a failure here, and that we're now looking to new arrangements?
Well, I think these are. This is new thinking. I think it's innovative. I think there are a lot of things within this document, within this framework, that in effect could be good for a solution to this problem. And I would simply ask people, especially within the unionist community, to look at what is there, to look at the very first page and realise that it is based on a principle of consent which is now accepted by the vast majority of people on the island of Ireland. And that principle of consent is then extended as well right through the document in terms of the suggested type of structures that might come about.
But unionists are saying it's worse than they expected.
Well, I'm not going to interpret the unionist position, but what I would say is this, that if we are going to solve this problem, we have got to do it on certain bases. The first is the principle of consent. The second thing are the rights and the aspirations of all sections of the people in the north of Ireland. And this framework document very clearly identifies those. I would put it more specifically, maybe for the first time they are clearly spelled out in the type of proposed institutional terms that I think that we can all get to.
Joint authority, or at least next door to joint authority, is how unionists will see it.
But you know it's not joint authority. I know it's not joint authority. I'll be honest, I wish it were, but it's not. The reality is that it's anything but joint authority. It is, I think, a very genuine attempt to suggest ways in which the type of rights and aspirations that nationalists in the north of Ireland have, to give them expression which transcends the narrow six-county confines, and to do it in such a way that it is leaving things open for development through consensus and agreement, and not through imposition. Because if we don't have agreement, we cannot do any of this. We cannot solve the problem. And I think I would again repeat to the unionist community and to their political representatives that once that basis of consent is there and accepted, once it is accepted that we can only change things by democratic, peaceful means.
Well, it's a point that we can put to the unionist representatives in the studio, but for now, Seamus Mallon, Martin McGuinness, thank you very much indeed. Can I start with you, Peter Robinson, on that? The point that Seamus Mallon makes there, that there can be no change unless there is permission from the unionist majority.
Well, the document, if it were a proper discussion document, would offer to unionists some alternatives. When you take away from this 37 pages the foliage from the verbiage that we have here, which is all very green in its context, and you get down to what the overriding proposition is, there is only one programme contained in that document, and that is a programme that leads to an all-Ireland, united Ireland. Now, that being the position, clearly consent doesn't come into it. You haven't got the consent of the unionist community for those kind of propositions. And therefore we have to say...
So what do you do? Do you stay away then? Because this is supposedly a framework document, a discussion document. So do you walk away from it and lose your fight by default, or do you get in there and argue your corner?
No, the Prime Minister has said, and unless you don't believe him, that this is a matter of a triple lock. The first lock is the parties. If the parties reject it, then the document is finished. So we're saying to the Prime Minister, we reject it, but we are prepared to talk to other constitutional parties and to the government on the basis of documents that we have presented to them, and no doubt the other parties have their own documents as well. That's the way forward. That's an obvious way forward where all of the parties will see on the agenda items that they can argue for themselves. There's nothing in this document for unionists.
Let me move on to Reg MP. Well, indeed, one of your senior MPs has said it's far worse than anyone imagined. But yet Jim Molyneux has been saying for a long time, you know, steady as she goes. The party does seem to have been caught out here, does it not?
Well, first of all, can I say that the purpose of a political party is to put its views forward as strongly as possible. We're a democratic party represented in Parliament, and that's what we have been doing for over the last number of years. The fact that the government has chosen to ignore the advice which it has been given is a matter for them. But the first thing I think I want to do, Paul, is to say that this is not a framework document. This is a draft international treaty. And if I would urge people strongly not to read the shortened version that's available for distribution, because that is actually a falsehood. Get the entire document and read that, because let me tell you that in addition to legislation which the United Kingdom Parliament is going to be asked to implement, there will be running in parallel with that a new treaty which will enforce a lot of these things if they were to be implemented. And this is the key point. At the end of the day, the Union is a matter for the people of Northern Ireland. They've expressed a view on that.
So why are you afraid then?
Because history would tell us that governments, John Bruton made it clear the other day when he was interviewed, if we as Unionists didn't negotiate on this, then you would be back to direct rule and the Anglo-Irish Agreement and what would flow from that. And that is the stick with which they wish to beat Unionists.
I must bring in John Alderdice here. John Alderdice, you've heard what Peter Robinson and Reg MP have said. You can see how difficult the task ahead is going to be.
I don't think I was under any illusions from my experience of the last few years as to how difficult the task could be.
But do you think there's any chance of getting agreement?
Well, I have to say that really I'm not surprised in reading these documents, anything that's in them, because almost everything that's there came up in some shape or form in the talks that there were, and particularly in 1992 and since then. What I do understand very clearly is that because we did not reach an agreement at that time, the two governments had to go away and produce something upon which we could work. Now, either we can move forward in this broad process, not accepting every piece of this document, I don't accept every piece of this document, but we can move forward in discussions to get a new and better agreement than the 1985 agreement. Or we can cop out of the process, and as Reg MP quite rightly says, we are back to the 1985 agreement with knobs on. And I don't think that's in anybody's interest, and that's why I'm a little bit encouraged, even at this difficult time, to note that Peter Robinson and Reg MP are both indicating their party's preparedness to talk about other proposals, and certainly we're prepared to take up that offer and invitation.
That is where the clock has beaten us, gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming in and joining us tonight.
Let me ask Nigel Dodds to look at just one of those details. The Republic has committed itself to a change in Articles 2 and 3. That has been one of the great unionist bugbears in the last few years. How can you do anything but welcome that?
Well, I think that we've heard promises before, and this is what simply is contained in this document. There is no specific wording whatsoever, and I think that that's highly significant. And if you read the document, and like David, I would urge people to read the document in full. I was alarmed today when one of my constituents contacted me to say that when they ring up this free phone number, all they're being entitled to be given is a summary. I think people have to read the entire document. When they do, they will see it for what it is, a programme for the two governments to push Northern Ireland down the road to a united Ireland, and that's what it is. As far as Articles 2 and 3 are concerned, what they're saying is very carefully worded in terms of the promise. They're saying that the threat that they claim to jurisdiction against the consent of the people of Northern Ireland will be removed. In other words, the insertion of some sort of consent clause, and we've known that for some time, that that's what they were thinking of doing.
It's a commitment to recognise the existence of Northern Ireland as it stands at the moment, as long as the majority of people wish it to remain so.
It is a promise that, once again, we're hearing from the Irish government. We heard all sorts of promises being made at the time of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which were never fulfilled. And we've got to remember also that in exchange for this promise to alter in some shape or form, as yet undefined and unspecified, Articles 2 and 3, which should go unilaterally because they were imposed unilaterally, in exchange for that, the Irish Republic is being offered a north-south body with massive executive, harmonising and consultative powers, which will force any Northern Ireland Assembly which is set up into a position where it's a mere puppet of Dublin, and where all issues, the vast range of issues which a Northern Ireland Assembly has to deal with, and which Northern Ireland politicians are elected to deal with, will in fact cannot go ahead unless they are agreed in advance or harmonised with or consulted with Dublin, first of all. And therefore, to sort of say, well, isn't this great that Articles 2 and 3 is gone, you've got to look at what in fact is going to what else is contained in that document?
Well, let me put those points to Seamus Mallon, who's in London. Nigel Dodds says the north-south body will make the Assembly just a puppet body.
No, what he was saying, of course, that any changes or amendments to Articles 2 and 3 would be in return for a north-south body. That's not true. The reality is there is a balancing constitutional element in the document. It's stated very clearly. The British government have yet to decide whether they're going to do their part of the constitutional amendment in terms of the Government of Ireland Act or a new piece of legislation.
But can you understand the unionist reaction that for what they're getting is a change in Articles 2 and 3, what the nationalists getting seems to be a lot more?
Well, they've told us for years that the whole problem was Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution. They have told us how fundamental that was to the problem. Indeed, in the last talks, they told us if there were amendments to those articles, that there would be an absolute sea change in attitudes within unionism. We have seen now the reaction. But I will wait until I see what both the British government and the Irish government say in relation to those in specific terms.
But is it not significant, Seamus Ballon, that you don't know today what that change will be? All it is a commitment. After 2 years of negotiations, the governments have not been able to agree what Articles 2 and 3 should be amended to.
I think if you listen to the Prime Minister in the House of Commons today, if you listen to the Taoiseach this morning, I think you would have no doubt whatsoever that there was a clear agreement between two governments as to what is going to happen in both of those terms.
In principle, but not in reality.
I suggest to you that this framework document would not have come out had there not been a very, very clear agreement between the two governments, and I would question your supposition there, because the reality is...
My supposition is simply based on the fact that the document doesn't contain that.
Yes, but it makes the commitment, the solemnly binding commitment as two sovereign governments. There are other elements that haven't been spelled out in this document either, some that I would like to know a lot more about as well. And, let's face it, there are things in this whole framework document and the whole approach that I may not be terribly happy with. But I'm prepared to enter into discussions. I'm prepared to wait and see what comes on paper. And I'm also prepared to do something else, and it is this, to recognise that if we're going to ever solve this problem, that the unionist people of the north of Ireland and the nationalist people, in broad terms, are going to have to both make the type of arrangements which they may not particularly like. We are all going to have to bite our lips at some stage in this process. And we are all going to have to realise that it is a sign of strength to do that rather than a sign of weakness, because if we are going to get the type of arrangements and institutions and the preservation and creation of real and lasting peace, then we have to make the compromises. And compromise has always been a dirty word in Irish politics.
Well, let's try and explore in the course of this programme.
Make it a word of strength.
Let us try and explore what some of those compromises might be. But first of all, John Alderdice, you've been shaking and nodding your head as these exchanges have been carrying on. What do you think is good and what do you think is bad?
Well, the first thing is, we've got unionists saying about this that there's not enough detail about the wording, but there's far too much detail about everything else. We've got people saying that the North-South body will find that the Assembly is accountable to it, when the document clearly says that it's the reverse, that the North-South body will be accountable to an Assembly in the North and indeed to the Dáil in the South. Now, the reality is this. In '85 we had an Anglo-Irish agreement. It's still in force 10 years later. It wasn't a very good agreement. Unionists in particular said, let's try to negotiate a better agreement. We came together in talks. We didn't reach an agreement. Virtually everything in this large document that I've read, I recognise from the inter-party talks. There's virtually nothing in this at all that wasn't discussed and put forward by various parties. All the parties put forward detailed documents. And many of us said to the two governments, why don't you put forward? You've asked all the rest of us, you're the sovereign governments, why don't you put forward the detailed documents that you should be agreeing on? They've put them forward for negotiation, for consultation. There are bits that I think are good in it. I like the business of the territorial claim being addressed. I like the business of the people of Northern Ireland having their own assembly and looking after their own affairs. I like the democratisation of the Anglo-Irish Conference by having input from the people of Northern Ireland. I like questions of human rights being addressed. I don't like this panel business. I think it's about political patronage. I don't like the fact that it seems the governments are going to have difficulty about letting go of law and order. I'd like to see the police in Northern Ireland being controlled by the people of Northern Ireland through their elected representatives. But I want to go in to negotiate a better agreement than the 1985 agreement, not to cop out of it, but to go in and negotiate a better agreement. And I think this is a basis for that negotiation, not a basis for alarm or hysteria.
David Trimble in London, are you prepared to desert the government over this and perhaps bring the government down?
Well, let's not get into questions of that and questions of parliamentary tactics, which will become clear as time develops.
But as part of the next step, it is important to know what your plans are.
I've told you what the next step is. The next step is that we're going to talk to the government about our proposals. We're going to probe the extent to which the government is committed to this document and whether the government is sincere about talking of this as being a consultative document seeking consent.
Well, as you say, we've covered that point then. What about the Northern Ireland Assembly? What do you think of that?
Well, I think actually there's one point I would agree with John Alderdice about this panel business, because actually my analysis of the document, when you look at it, is that there will be no power in the Assembly, but all the power will be in the three-man panel, because it is that three-man panel, which presumably will be Paisley, Hume and Jim Molyneux. That three-man panel will appoint the chairman, will make decisions whenever there's a disagreement, will decide policy issues, particularly with regard to finance and other matters. And the power is essentially there, not in the Assembly. And I think, and requiring it to operate by consensus means that this is going to build in deadlock. You know, I remember John Alderdice talks about what happened in the inter-party talks. I remember remarking to a civil servant when people were getting deeply into these checks and balances that if we're not careful, you're going to end up with something like the original Cyprus Independence Constitution of 1960, which had so many checks and balances, it was inoperable and actually caused a civil war in Cyprus and created the divisions within Cyprus that have existed over the last 30 years. And I think the pudding has been over-egged in that respect. We've got to strip away all of that, get back to much more sensible proposals, such as those that were virtually agreed in the inter-party talks in 1992. And I think we've got to actually junk most of the other provisions in this framework document as well, in order to be able to make progress.
Nigel Dodds, let's look at this three-person panel. There have been people today saying this seems specifically designed for Ian Paisley to assume the mantle of the most powerful man in Northern Ireland, which he is always telling us he has more votes than anyone else, that he is that person anyway.
I don't think it's a question of anybody telling anybody. It's the fact that he has more votes than anybody else in a European election. But, I mean, we never agreed to any such panel, nor did the DUP propose such a panel. And but that isn't the main concern about whether we have a panel or whatever. The main concern in this is that we have a document, which is not a discussion document, but which sets out clearly a road to Dublin. And I don't think we should lose sight of the overall picture here by getting hung up on some issues in relation to a panel or committees and so on and so forth.
But David Trimble says it's the most important question. That is where the power resides in this Assembly.
Yes, in relation to the Assembly, that issue, of course, we would have our ideas in that, and we would have our contribution to make on that.
Will you be
and that will be a matter
for
discussion. We will be fighting every election that comes our way in terms of
It was said at one point, I believe, that the DUP might seek election to this Assembly to wreck it. Would you do that?
Well, I think that that's entirely a misrepresentation of our view. What we said is that we would fight our seats at any election, particularly at an Assembly election, and that we would use that Assembly to wreck any process designed to take us into a united Ireland. And can I say that as far as this document is concerned, leave aside this panel business or whatever, that is a side issue compared to the big issue, which is that we're going to have an Assembly in which those who are elected cannot take office in that Assembly as chairman of a committee or head of department unless they bind themselves to take part in a North-South body with executive powers. And at the same time, we will have an Anglo-Irish conference and its secretariat, which is now not only going to be in the form of a treaty, but which is actually going to be legislated for at Westminster, which is going to be set in concrete. So everybody who was against the Anglo-Irish agreement, not only are we going to see it strengthened, but we're going to see all these other pieces which are anathema to unionists tacked on.
I want to ask you one more question, Nigel Dodds. Are you going to talk to the government, or in what form, under what circumstances will you talk to the government now that this document is on the table?
We have made it clear, and we made it clear since the Downing Street Declaration was signed, that the government was headed down the wrong course. We said then, when people were saying, oh, you're talking rubbish and you're isolated and all the rest of it, look, the Downing Street Declaration sets the foundation for this sort of framework document. And a lot of people were saying, well, let's wait and see and judge the Downing Street Declaration on the framework document. We see tonight that those who were supporting the Downing Street Declaration, what we have been left with in the framework document. But in terms of our position, we have published our proposals. They're constructive proposals which would allow the politicians in Northern Ireland to set the agenda. And we would like to see the government We would like to talk to the government about those. We fully intend to do that, but we will not be sitting down at any table in which the framework document is the basis for discussions.
Nigel Dodds and David Trimble in London, thank you both very much for the moment. Let me turn back to Seamus Mallon. Mr. Mallon, you said there were some things you weren't happy with. Tell us about them.
Well, I would like to have seen the Assembly, the proposed Assembly, more on the line or on the basis of the Assembly of 1973 under the Sunningdale Agreement. I would have liked to have seen that as the basis from which we started.
For those who don't remember that, explain the difference.
Well, the difference is that you had got what Mr. Trimble is looking for. You had a situation where you had cabinet responsibility by consensus, where you had, in effect, you didn't have the committee system on the basis which is spelled out here. That's one of the things. There will be unease within the island of Ireland about constitutional change. Let's make no mistake about that. There will be unease. There will be people who will look at the situation and, as you say yourself, will say this panel is a means of getting a unionist of whatever hue in as a Prime Minister by another door. I don't accept that, by the way, but there are those who will look at it in those terms. But the reality is that if we take this framework document, you have got the thinking and the parameters of the sovereign British government, and you have got the thinking of the sovereign Irish government. And that's crucial for two reasons. That they have a right to plan for the future. Let's face it, if you are part of, as the unionists claim, if they are a part of Britain, then I think the sovereign British Parliament has some say in the matter. If, as many people, including myself, our aspirations would be towards Irish unity, I think the people in the Republic of Ireland have a right to tell us and suggest the way in which we can get there. If we are going to get there, and the only way in which we can do it is by consent, which is copper fastened in this document, I think we shouldn't forget the rights of the two sovereign governments in this. And we should also remember, you know, we're a very small part of a very large problem. And at the end of the day, if it's going to be solved, we are going to do it. And
Okay,
essentially, and I said it in the House of Commons today, and I'll say it again.
Briefly, if you could, Seamus Mallon.
I'll say it's essentially, primarily, agreement between the Ulster Unionist Party and the people that we represent, the SDLP. There are others, like the Alliance Party, who will have a major part to play, like Sinn Féin, who have got to be included in whatever comes about.
Well, Sinn Féin are going to be represented in this discussion. Let me stop you there, please, Seamus, and we must move it on. Time is short, as you know. I'm joined now in the studio by Gerry Adams, the President of Sinn Féin. Good evening to you. Now, the Republic has committed itself to changing Articles 2 and 3, to use your own words back at you, copper fastening partition. How can you be happy about that?
Well, I think what they have agreed to do in the terms of an overall settlement is to change Articles 2 and 3. I think the fact that they didn't give a definitive proposal on that is a mark of the fact that no Irish government could go for a change in Articles 2 and 3.
So unionists are right to be suspicious of that gap in the document today?
Well, it's my view that an Irish government would not get the support of the Irish electorate for any change in Articles 2 and 3, which copper fasten partition, or which recognise the British jurisdiction in this state.
So that's an empty commitment?
Well, I mean, let's not deal with the specifics, because I don't want to be coming in here at the tail end of a discussion with all the other parties.
You'll have plenty of time.
Well, thank you. Let me say, first of all, that I welcome the publication of the framework document today. I say that because the framework document is a document which should herald the beginning of talks. All of these points, including the one you've just made, are points for negotiation and for discussion. That marks a new phase of the peace process. And I think it's very important that we get down to those talks and those negotiations with all urgency.
But if you can be sanguine about it, doesn't that give unionists reason to fear it?
Well, you know, the unionists and their leaderships have always said no. Their response was, I think, sadly, a very, very predictable one. And I also think that they're out of steps at leadership level with the broad thrust of grassroots opinion, because while grassroots opinion mightn't have diminished in terms of its commitment to the union, people there do want to see talks and do want to see an arrangement made which brings about a permanent peace. Now, Mr. Molyneux and Mr. Paisley cannot forever prevent or erect obstacles to moving the situation forward so that the people of this island can work out an agreement among ourselves.
It's dangerous for you to presume to know what grassroots unionists are thinking, clearly.
Well, I'm in touch with grassroots unions.
Well, perhaps with some of them, but Probably not as many as the unionist leaders themselves are. And certainly some of the opinions we've heard today voiced on radio and television, of grassroots opinions such as it is, are saying that they do fear there is something of a sellout in this document. But
can I just comment on that? You see, therein lies the folly of Mr. Molyneux's special relationship with the British Prime Minister. Because there is actually no section of the Irish people more distrustful of the British government than the unionist people. Here we have a section of our people, the unionists, who profess a loyalty to the British Parliament and the Crown and so on and so forth, and yet who distrust them immensely. And I think there's a re-examination of, at an individual level, by many unionists of where exactly they're going. And that's one of the reasons why I welcome this document. There are things in it which Republicans wouldn't agree with, and I have to say it isn't either a solution or a settlement, but it does acknowledge that there can be no internal settlement. I think that's very, very, very important. There's an all-Ireland, single-island ethos permeating throughout the entire document, and unionists need to come to terms with that.
Did you say today that this document was proof that Northern Ireland was a failed state?
Well, I think when you see the number of initiatives that have been brought forward, and remember this one has come just over a year after the Downing Street Declaration, is all proof of the fact that partition hasn't worked and that British policy to date has not worked.
But that's why unionists fear it, because they see it as a betrayal of them by the British government.
Well, the only thing which Republicans are threatening unionists with is democracy. Whatever about their relationship with the British government, our bottom line is that the people of this island can do a better job of governing ourselves than those British ministers who the unionists distrust and dislike so much.
Let me pick you up on some details. I know you're not going to make a detailed statement until after the Ardèche, but do you think you'd be prepared to sit in this new assembly?
Well, Sinn Féin, in terms of Stormont, is an abstentionist party, and it would need the party to change all of that. But everyone accepts, and this document says so, implicitly and explicitly, that there is no such thing as an internal settlement. There's no such thing as an internal solution. So we need to look at everything to go, not just to talk, but to go to listen. And I think Sinn Féin is quite capable of doing that.
Let me just turn to John Alderdice briefly. You're as usual, in the middle here, perhaps, between the two sides. What do you think is the next step in the process?
Well, I think what's very clear is that there's quite a range of analyses, and I have to say that I don't accept the analyses, particularly of those who are on the more extreme edges. It seems to me that the way forward is for us to get into discussions and negotiations, preferably on this document, with the governments, with different parties. There are those parties who said they won't get into discussions on this document, but they will get into discussions on their own documents. I've already made very clear to both the DUP and the Ulster unions we'll happily meet with them and talk about their documents. But we shouldn't deceive people. This document comes out of a long process of discussion. The principles in this document are going to be the kinds of principles upon which a settlement is going to be based. That is the direction in which we have to move, and I hope the talks, bilateral, multilateral, and eventually round table, is the direction all of us have to move in.
John Alderdice, thank you. Let me just tell you that Nigel Dodds was saying that his constituents were annoyed that they couldn't get hold of a full copy of the document. I must inform you that copies of the full text of both documents, that's the framework and the proposals for the Assembly, are available on this number, and that's 0800.
To Belfast. We have in the studio here Sinn Féin President Gerry Adams and Alliance Party Deputy Leader Seamus Close. And from Dublin, Fianna Fáil's Foreign Affairs spokesman Ray Burke joins us. First of all, to you, Gerry Adams. We've heard much of the unionist disappointment about all of this. Nationalists, and in particular Sinn Féin, have a difficult pill to swallow: the unambiguous recognition by the south of the northern state, the acknowledgement of two jurisdictions, and a far cry from national self-determination.
Well, I think what we have is a framework document for discussion. It isn't a solution. It doesn't pretend to be a settlement. And I think it's very pertinent to point out that no Irish government, I think, would win a referendum with the Irish electorate if they were wanting to change Articles 2 and 3 in a way which recognised British jurisdiction here, or which diluted the broad, correct and proper claim of Ireland to its own integrity. Now, I think that, and we witnessed it there with Ken McGuinness. I think what we have to do is to move into the next stage of this peace process. And I welcome the framework document because its publication means that we are going to move into discussions. And what are the discussions going to be about? About getting agreement. There are things in the framework document which Sinn Féin and nationalists won't like. That's fair enough. Let us sit down, thrash it out, take it back and forth, and try to get an agreement about how the people of this island can decide and work out our own future.
To quote Brian Feeney, he said, nationalists can dance at a British crossroads, acknowledging really that the state of Northern Ireland would continue to exist as long as the majority of people within it wish that to be the case. Now, do you acknowledge that?
Well, it's first of all very important that we look at what is underlying this document. It has come a very short term after the Downing Street Declaration. It is an indication of the need for change, and that's implicit and explicit within it. It clearly recognises that there can be no internal settlement, and there's clearly throughout it a one Ireland, all Ireland ethos. Now, it doesn't move far enough for the Republicans, but that's a matter for discussion. Let's sit down, thrash it out, and move the entire situation forward.
Is it sufficient to prolong the peace process and for Sinn Féin to sell to the IRA?
Well, it isn't a matter of us selling anything to the IRA. It's a matter of all of the people of this island, through those parties which have a democratic mandate, sitting down with both governments and working out our future together, because what we have here, and this was, I think, coming through from the people in Ballysillan, who spoke more sense, in my opinion, because they live in the real world, than the unionist leadership. The opportunity for peace that we have now should not be squandered.
Let me bring you in, Seamus Close. The dialogue or lack of it between the SDLP and unionists that we saw in London in our interview a few moments ago, and that we saw in London earlier today with David Trimble, would indicate that the scenario is terribly gloomy in terms of bringing the unionists into this process.
Certainly on what we have seen today, it doesn't give one an awful lot of hope. But I think that the challenge which is facing us all is to recognise that this is a document for negotiation and a document for discussion. The challenge facing all of us is to recognise and to pose, each of us to pose the question, are we prepared to compromise? Are we prepared to recognise that what has taken part in the past has theoretically and effectively failed, and that if we are going to move forward, we must move forward together and try something different? I think we've got to look at it and see what is in it, rather than looking at it from a pessimistic point of view. Let's examine the document and say and find out what is in it for unionists and what is in it for nationalists, what is in it, therefore, for the entire community. And I think if we approach the document from that standpoint, we can recognise and see within it opportunities to move forward. Now, you pose the very pertinent question, what if people do not become involved in the dialogue? If, for example, the unionists opt out? Well, the fact of the matter is that if the unionists opt out, then all of those things that the unionist people complain about, for example, the democratic deficit which exists in Northern Ireland, will unfortunately continue. The relationship, the Anglo-Irish Agreement and the Anglo-Irish Conference will continue. It will be built upon, and it will be built upon without any accountability whatsoever back to the people of Northern Ireland. Is that what we want?
Let me bring you in here, Ray Burke. There would be some sort of consensus between Gerry Adams and Ken McGuinness that if Articles 2 and 3 were put to a referendum in the South, that there would be no support for change. Would you concur with that?
Well, what we are determined to do, and this was spelled out very clearly today in the Dáil by Party Leader Bertie Ahern, is that we're determined to maintain the integrity of the nation as set out in Article 2 of our Constitution, and we're not prepared to accept a 26-county-based definition of the nation. But let me be positive and tell you what we are prepared for. The Article 2 says at the moment, very briefly, the national territory consists of the whole island of Ireland, its islands and the territorial seas. And we are prepared for the addendum to be flexible and is the shared inheritance of all the people of Ireland in their diverse identities and traditions. I think that's a very positive step forward by Fianna Fáil to set out exactly what is involved in Article 2 and the addendum to Article 2, and should help in the discussions with the unionists, because we believe it is in effect in the document as it is, in the framework as published today, that this type of wording has not been set out.
What you're willing to accept, Mr. Burke, is significantly less than what the Taoiseach outlined today, which is the lifting of the claim of jurisdiction over the North.
That in relation to Article 3, we wish to retain in our Constitution a strong commitment to the ideal of a united Ireland, and the whole question of consent comes in there, and the legitimate national objective of a united Ireland. But it is our
So that's the point. You're making the point yourself. I mean, there's no way that you could agree to a lifting of that claim of jurisdiction, is there?
We are saying very clearly in relation to Article 2 that you cannot say to the people living in Armagh or Down or in Derry that they are no longer Irish. And no Fianna Fáil party or no sensible democratic party in the south would put to the Irish people and ask them to cut away our brethren in the north. You cannot do that, and we will never do it as a party. We have said how far we will go, but it has been it is a very generous step forward and it is a major step forward, and was recognised by the Taoiseach himself when he was here tonight as being a major step forward. But we wanted, rather than just featuring the constitutional change, you have a three-strand process going on here at the moment. Today was strand 2 and 3 in the framework document, and I would call tonight on the Irish government, not just on the British government, but on the Irish government, to play a major role, because strand 2 was between the north and the south.
Have to cut you off
must
there.
get in there and talk at this stage in relation and become persuaders of the Unionists.
I must interrupt you and bring in here Gerry Adams in Belfast. The problem essentially here is that there is so much Unionist suspicion that it would seem as though the inter-party talks cannot take place and won't take place. And if the Unionists are not involved in this dialogue, then the framework's going to go nowhere.
Well, it's my view that Unionists will be involved, and we can't have a settlement without them.
The DUP and the official Unionists?
Oh, it's my view. It's the timing is up to them. But we're totally committed to this process. I want to see a situation where the people of this island can agree a settlement where we can live together in prosperity, where we can improve our economic situation, and that needs the Unionists. Now, they mightn't want to talk now, but they need to remember that every single time there has been an initiative and it has floundered, then the next initiative has moved the situation on even further. So the choice is theirs. I am certainly confident that the DUP and the UUP will sit down with the rest of us.
Briefly, Seamus Close.
Well, I think that people power is going to be exceedingly important. And I've been encouraged by the people that I've spoken to today on the streets. I've been encouraged listening to the different news programmes where people on the streets have been spoken to. I've been interested by the response from the CBI, from the Institute of Directors, from the captains of industry in Northern Ireland, who are saying, look, this is a way forward. And they are going to exert pressure on their elected leaders to get into negotiations and to move the process forward.
Gerry Adams, Seamus Close, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
From the Unionist community is that the nationalists are being placated in the framework document, which was released today, and they are trying to, by actions like this, keep that Unionist, the Unionist political representatives and that Unionist community very settled.
Policing and the release of prisoners matter far more to ordinary Republicans in Derry's Bogside than the constitutional ambiguities of the framework document. But people here have been reassured by the outright hostility of the Unionists under the age-old maxim of Northern Ireland politics: if they think they're losing, then we must be winning. In Derry, Sinn Féin leading figure Martin McGuinness spent the day in TV and radio studios, carefully gauging every remark and reaction out of London. His party won't give its response to the framework document till after the Sinn Féin conference at the weekend. But he wasn't immediately dismissive about the document.
I'm not saying that I'm euphoric about that at all. What I'm saying clearly is that here we have a very lengthy, detailed and complex document, which Sinn Féin as a political movement will have to give a very serious consideration in the coming weeks. We intend to do that, and then we will issue a very considered response to that document.
In Republican areas like the Bogside, rejecting the document out of hand would be very unpopular. At a local community centre, women in the sewing class talk of how the peace has transformed their lives.
It's wonderful.
really wonderful for the people, especially now mothers that are bringing up young children. They can have peace of mind when their children go out at night. Myself, my age group with our children, we were always, hearts were up our throats wondering were they going to come in safe at night. But now with the peace, it's just wonderful.
What difference has the ceasefire made?
Well, it means there's a feeling that peace is going to come.
Why do you think that?
Because people are now willing to talk where they weren't before.
This enthusiasm for the ceasefire among his own people means Martin McGuinness must put the best possible gloss on the framework document. He needs to show his political strategy is working.
How will they do Pat Kelly now? The document has an all-Ireland character about it. And I see in that a very clear, explicit and implicit acceptance and acknowledgement by the British government that the Sixth County State has failed, that the partition of Ireland has failed, and that even British rule itself has been a failure. There's a recognition in the document by the British government of the need for change. And in our opinion, that change has to be fundamental, political and constitutional.
But Eamon McCann, a writer from the Bogside who's been studying the framework document, thinks it falls well short of Republican goals.
I don't think that the grassroots of the Republican movement in places like the Falls Road and the Bogside will regard the machinery envisaged in this document as an adequate return on the investment, so to speak, that they have made over this past 25 years.
Unease about the reaction of Republican hardliners to the document may explain why there isn't going to be a debate at the party's conference this weekend, although Sinn Féin is swift to deny that it's nervous about the Ardèche.
We have no fear whatsoever of our grassroots. We have been in very intimate contact with our grassroots right from the beginning of this process, and nobody is under any illusions whatsoever about the strategy which has been adopted by the leadership of Sinn Féin, and we have received tremendous support from our grassroots, so people should not be in the least concerned about that.
Why not have a full debate on it then?
Because it doesn't suit us to have a full debate. The document has only been published today. The Sinn Féin Ardèche is only days away. It is not the proper arena to have an intimate debate about a very serious and complex and detailed document.
I don't think that over the next few weeks Sinn Féin is going to have any great difficulties in maintaining the confidence and trust of its own supporters. I think that in the longer term there is going to be difficulty about convincing those among its supporters who are passionate about a united Ireland, of convincing them that this document and anything that comes from it will represent real progress towards a united Ireland of a sufficient nature and at a sufficient pace to allow them to go entirely constitutional, so to speak.
But as everybody tries to absorb the complexities of the document, in the Bogside Community Centre, people have priorities other than the political agenda.
When all the lofty issues about the great constitutional matters disappear, round here on the ground, the real issues are jobs and policing. They're not mentioned in this document in any serious way, and that is a big disappointment.
While Irish identity is extremely important here, children are taught the language in their nursery. For some women, there are more pressing worries than their constitutional status.
They shouldn't forget about the prisoners, like, that's up there in the jails either, like. They should be sorting them out too.
Why are the prisoners important?
Because I know a prisoner that's in there, and he's away now for so many years now, and he's another 7 years to do. And he's the father of my children, and I think that they have forgotten about them, that they should be released.
Sinn Féin needs more concrete success like the release of prisoners. By going for what it calls an unarmed strategy, it's created a momentum it may not be able to control. Republican sympathisers in the wider community wouldn't forgive a return to violence, but hardline activists are unlikely to be satisfied by what's currently on the table.